writing style that
Yes.
helped you much, or that stuck with you much later on?
Yeah. Well, one of my professors was David Cavers. David Cavers taught conflicts. He was also the editor-in-chief for the faculty advisor for Law and Contemporary Problems, which was our law review. And one summer, I did an article for Law and Contemporary Problems under his guidance. I remember what an impressive fellow he was. He had been first in his class at Harvard Law School, which we knew meant that he was one of the top echelon. And I'd go in to see him as he was critiquing my drafts. He would sit there, he'd smoke cigarettes, and great big smoke rings would come out, and I was fascinated by that. At the same time, he'd be grading papers. He'd be reading my copy here and advising me. He could do three things at the same time and each equally well. And I said, well, that's a genius. And I realized that I certainly wasn't in that class.
Didn't he took some of your writing and
talked
to you about the length
no,
of...
When it took me, he was very actually complimentary. I worked awfully hard, but it was slow. And he said, it should flow more freely. And he said, you've got constipation in writing. You've got to let it flow out more easily. But writing has always been difficult for me. I never have been able just to let it rip out, as some people seem to be able to do it. Cavers did something else that was very nice that I remembered. In our first year, I recall that I couldn't go home to Christmas, of course. And he and his wife invited two of us for Christmas dinner at their house. And I remember it was so nice. They had chestnut dressing and another dish that they had that I'd never had before and never had it as good since. She took these little tiny onions and served it in a cream sauce. And for them to take two law school students far away from home and do that, I thought was beyond the call of duty.
Didn't one of the upperclassmen give you some advice about your
well, I was scared that first year because, as I said, they pulled no punches. And the faculty was very tough on us. And they deliberately wanted to scare us. They thought by scaring us we'd work harder, and they were right. You either worked harder or you quit. But one evening, late in the libraries, one evening, I guess it was around 11:30, I was working in the library studying. And Bill Adelson, a big hulking fellow, a lawyer, who later became a lawyer in Maryland, came by and he says, Nixon, he said, what's the matter? You look a little worried. I said, gee, Bill, I'm scared. I said, all these guys, and this course is so hard and so forth and so on. I don't know whether I'm ever going to keep this scholarship. This is just before mid-year exams. He looked at me with his cynical look. He says, don't worry, Nixon. You're going to do all right. You know what it takes to learn the law? I said, no. An iron butt. And you got one.
Can you describe what life was like in Whippoorwill Manor?
Well, in Whippoorwill Manor, four of us lived. And we lived there for $5 a month.
Well, it was
not
essentially
each.
Just a shack almost, wasn't it?
Not each. It's $5 for the four of us a month. What it was a house. A lady lived there with her daughter, and we lived in one room. The reason that she wanted us there was it was in the middle of the Duke Forest, and she was glad to have people there for security purposes. And so they had this one room, and there were two iron beds, double beds, and two of us, Purdue and I slept in one bed, and Brownfield and Albrinck slept in the other bed. There was a big pot-bellied iron stove in the middle. In the middle of the winter, we'd stuff paper into it the night before we went to bed. We crawled in at midnight, never before that. And then the first one up in the morning would light the fire so that it heated up the room, took the chill off. Then we would get into our clothes and walk the 1.5 miles that it took get back to the campus. We shaved over at in the men's room at the campus and took our showers later in the day when we went out to play a little handball or something like that. But it was worth it to do it for $5 a month.
Didn't you live on Milky Ways at this time?
To the devastation of my teeth and the and the prosperity of my dentist over the year, yes. For 3 years, this will find it hard to believe, I had a Milky Way for breakfast, period. And it did do damage to the teeth, but it certainly was good for the pocketbook because it only cost 5 cents.
There's a story I've heard about the inability of your group at the time to resist anything free, and that Albrecht may have taken it to the limit when there was a free test offered at the hospital and he signed all of you up for it.
I had forgotten about that, but we, you know, you hear about how the Depression was such a sad time. But I look back on that Depression in Whittier, I look back at in law school and the rest, it wasn't a sad time. We had a good time. We had to work pretty hard. People weren't beating on our doors I don't remember people coming around except for those that were trying to get agents for the FBI who were looking for jobs and so forth. That's one of the reasons I could relate so well to Eisenhower. When he came home to Abilene and made his announcement for running for president, and he described his early life in Denison and then later Abilene, Kansas. And he said, we were poor then, but the glory of it was we never knew it. And I would say that in our case, we never felt put upon because we didn't have that much, that we had to work, that we had to live on Milky Ways or 25-cent lunches and that sort of thing, or live at Whippoorwill Manor without inside plumbing. It's just a different attitude. I'm not sure that ethic is, however, not gone.
What were your options as you finished law school? What did you want to be when you grew up?
Well, I think then I had the idea that I wanted to be a lawyer, but also probably to go into politics, because I discussed it with Dean Horak, who was my faculty advisor. You see, I worked in the library there. I did research work for Dean Horak. One summer I mimeographed a whole case book by hand for Douglas Maggs on constitutional law. And during the course of that, I got to know these professors pretty well, and I'd ask them for their advice. And Dean Horak said, don't go to New York. If you're interested in politics, go home. Practice law at home. You may not get as much money, but that's the only way if you want to do anything in the political area. So I eventually went home. But we went before that. I made a try at some other things, went up to New York, and I was interviewed up there along with the others at various firms. The only one that showed any interest in me was a very good one, Donovan, Leisure, Newton, and Lombard. I met all the senior partners there, including Wild Bill Donovan, whom I later met when he was ambassador to Thailand after I was vice president in 1953, and then again before he died when I saw him at Walter Reed in 1958. But they wrote me about a month after I was there asking if I was still interested, and I replied at that point that I'd made a decision in another direction. Another one was the FBI. They were recruiting, and I met with the recruiter, as did several of us, and didn't hear anything from them. Years later, I was talking to Edgar Hoover at a dinner at Alice Longworth's house, and I sort of gigged him a little. I said, you know, I applied for the FBI and couldn't get in. Well, Hoover, of course, is very political, and but I think this is not apocryphal. I think this is actually what happened. He called me a couple of days later. By that time, I was vice president, and he said, you know, I've checked the records. And he said, I found that in the year 1936, as a matter of fact, you were approved for special agent, but we were unable to offer you a position because the Congress had not increased our appropriation, which is probably the only time the Congress didn't approve one of his increases of appropriation. So I ended up going back home.
And you joined a law firm. First you had to pass the California bar, which...
A tough challenge. Because the California bar, I had not studied California law at Duke. I didn't know anything about the California Code, evidence, corporations, things like that. I took a cram course, which was a four-month cram course, and I only had 6 weeks to do it. So I went up to my grandmother's house, and I locked myself in there with no interruptions. I studied hard and took the bar.
You said at one point that you went there because it was quiet. You could sit in the upstairs room and she would bring you creamed chipped beef.
She was a fine cook, as were all of my aunts and my mother as well. But she made chipped beef in a different way. I've never had it since. You know, these days you get chipped beef at a restaurant. They just take big slices of beef and chipped beef and then cream it off, and it's a pretty gooey stuff. But she would do it so meticulously. She'd chop it up very, very fine, and then she'd stir the flour in, and then the cream and so forth, and you'd serve it on toast. And it was a real delicacy.
You've told the story about getting word about the results of the exam, the size of the envelope indicating whether you'd passed or failed.
Well, once you took the bar exam, it's pretty scary taking it, and it's even scarier waiting to see whether you passed. See, the bar exam was 3 days of written examination, 7 hours a day. And everything that you have learned in 3 years of law school, it's all on the line with those 3 days. And so I thought back, my God, I wonder if they can read my writing. I've never been a very legible writer, and I wonder if I knew enough, and so forth and so on. And so I waited and waited and waited. And I had been told that when you received notice of the bar, that it would be received by mail. And if it were a large envelope, give up, because a large envelope would simply have application blanks for you to apply to take it again. If you had passed, it would be a small envelope. Well, we watched and watched and watched for it. And my mother went to the mailbox. It was Rural Route 1, Box 75A on Leffingwell Road. And she came in, and the tears were coming down her cheek because I had told her about the large and small envelope. And she handed me a brown manila envelope. It wasn't very big, but it wasn't small. So I took it, and I went into the bathroom to open it. I opened it up, and I'd passed. And I came out, and everybody cheered and so forth. And if we'd been a drinking family, we'd have had a drink. But as it was, we celebrated in milk.
After you were back in Whittier that you became involved in amateur dramatics and had the lead in, the night of January 16th?
The night of January 16th and Dark Tower.
And it was at the rehearsal for Dark Tower that an important event occurred.
Yes, that was the occasion when I first met Pat. And she was a beautiful girl, and striking and vibrant, and there was no question about her being the dominant force as far as that play was concerned and as far as my life was concerned. So I asked her for a date after I had taken her home from the rehearsal, and she said, "Well, I'm very busy." And then I said to her, "Well, I think you should go, I think we should go out because, you know, I'm going to marry you someday." Well, it was very uncharacteristic for me to say something so impulsive because I usually put things down on a yellow pad, pros and cons and so forth and so on. Here's the biggest decision of my life, certainly up to that time. But also, like most successful politicians, I have intuition. And when you have intuition, you just do it. I always believe in making the big play. And so I made the big play, and this time it worked.
Was it love at first sight then?
For me, yes. For her, I think it took a little more time.
You courted through
oh, yes.
For several months.
Yes. We like the same things. We like the beach. We like the mountains. We like good movies. We like good music. We went to Hollywood Bowl on every occasion we possibly could.
You've said something I can sympathize with, that when you would go to the beach, which you both liked, you had to sit covered up because you would burn badly.
I burned very badly. And as a matter of fact, she used to laugh a bit. We always took an umbrella with us, and we'd take the umbrella out. And even with the umbrella, I would have to keep on a T-shirt. I could not leave my back exposed, or I'd have the most terrible sunburn. And so, and she didn't have that problem at all.
How did you propose?
Well, I was proposing from the moment I met her. That wasn't necessary. It was just a question of when she would accept. And it finally happened out I think at Dana Point, as a matter of fact, looking
Is
out
that,
over the
that
Pacific.
story is true then, that in the
That's right.
gazebo at Dana Point?
At Dana Point, as a matter of fact, she finally said yes, and that was it.
What do you think made her say yes at that point?
I wouldn't try to judge. I think there were a number of considerations, perhaps, but we got along very well. There was a lot of mutual respect, and also a lot of very deep affection. But she was, of course, an interesting thing about her, incidentally, is that she was a very remarkable person, too. The women of my life have all been remarkable. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, Pat, my daughters. And in her case, she never told me. We never talked about what we had done, where we had been, what we had been through. It was always about the future, never about the past. I didn't know till years later, for example, that she had worked as a movie extra in Hollywood. And I didn't know, for example, until shortly after we were married, that she'd spent a couple of years in New York working as an X-ray technician in order to help her work her way through school. I didn't know that she'd been a teller in a bank. She never had told me about some of her family problems, the tragedy of her mother who died of cancer when she was about 9 years of age, her father who died when she was 16. She never told me, for example, that she worked at Bullock's Wilshire as a sales girl, and that she could have done all this and still graduated from USC with honors. And incidentally, she also worked there for Dr. Watt, a professor in sociology, as a research assistant. To do all that, to take care of her brothers as she cooked for them and so forth after her father died and nursed him when he was sick, and then to come out as she did, this is quite a story in itself.
What did you talk about?
Well, I think we talked more about the future. We talked about places we wanted to go. She wanted to travel. I wanted to travel. She had an adventurous spirit. I did too. We talked about we of course were both very fond of movies. This is before the days of television and so forth, and there were very good movies to see and good ones to talk about. We did not talk politics, not at that stage.
Isn't it true that until you went to get the wedding license, the marriage license, that you didn't know what her real name was?
Oh, that's true. Her name actually was Thelma Ryan. She didn't like that name, and so she took the name very early on of Pat Ryan because that's what her father called her. Her father was Irish. Her mother was born in Germany. I remember when I saw Adenauer, he was very impressed by Pat. And he said to me, "Tell me her background." And I said, "Well, she's half Irish and half German." He snapped his finger and he says, "That's the best combination of all, German strength and Irish beauty." And she's got both. And her mother, let's see, where were we there?
We were talking about her name.
Yeah.
About,
Well, her father then, she was born on the 16th, but very late at night. And her father, when she was born, said, "She'll be St. Patrick's babe in the morning." And so from then on, he called her Pat. And so she took the name Pat. And as a result, she has, when our daughters were born, she said, we'll not, and both Tricia and Julie, don't give them a second name. They may not like the names we give them, let them have their choice.
this is your wedding picture, taken at the
Riverside Inn.
yes.
A double-breasted suit.
You remember the day.
Yes, and I remember the trip we went to Mexico. We took that whole honeymoon trip. We spent 2 weeks in Mexico. We had a great time. We did it on $150, portal to portal.
Hadn't your friends prepared
Our
a
friends took care
special
of us.
surprise for you?
Yes. As a matter of fact, they gave us a lot of canned goods to take along because they knew we were going to stay on auto carts and have to take. And The difficulty was that they took all the wrappers off the cans. So when we got down and we'd open the cans, we didn't know whether we were going to have peas, beans, spam, sausage, what have you. But that made a lot of fun too.
After a while, as being a lawyer in Whittier, you got through an old law school professor, through Cavers, you got an offer to go to Washington as essentially as a bureaucrat in the.
Excuse me, Frank.
Yep.
Tape's up. We just hit the end of the second reel. Maybe we should wrap here and pick up in the morning. What do you think? You want to put up another reel?
Well, what do you think? I think we could do a little bit more.
Maybe not a whole reel, but
Let's do a half a reel about, because how much, let's get through
get through 46.
Get through 46.
Let me.
I mean, through the election.
Yeah.
I think we should. We're rolling on
Yes.
that, and then we can get to the other, and then you'll be on schedule.
Yeah.
Good. It's coming along fine.
Take us 2 minutes.
Right.
As we go through the light change, you can start into camera 1.
Do you think that you had a career as a bureaucrat, a government bureaucrat?
No, I could never have stayed in government. Not that I didn't learn something at OPA, but it seemed to me that as I was in government and saw what they did, that it was very important not to have government run things. I don't mean that there weren't so many dedicated people there, and particularly during the wartime period. But on the other hand, it was very discouraging to me when my superior, David Lloyd, told me on one occasion that I could get a promotion from a P3, which got $3,200 a year, to a P4, where you'd make $3,800 a year if I'd build a little staff. Well, I told him I didn't need a little staff. I could do what I was doing without it. This was learning to write letters about tire rationing and that sort of thing. That turned me off. But also another thing that turned me off was what I considered to be unnecessarily arrogance, frankly, of little people in big jobs. I mean, the way they seemed to really delight in turning down some poor guy at a service station and so forth when he'd write in about his tires that he needed for his rations and so forth and so on. I could see then, and incidentally, it's something that happens through government today too, that you put little people in big jobs and they want to push other people around. No, I thought LPA was necessary. However, it gave me a very good feeling about why government should be limited to what is necessary and what it really can do and not be expanded.
How did your family feel when you decided to enlist in the service in the Navy?
1 second, Frank, sorry. Keep the tapes rolling. Ray's got to come in for 1 second.
Recognize that young man?
Is it better hair out of place? Or? Okay.
How is that, Roger?
All right.
Okay, stand by. We're still rolling 5.
How did your family feel when you decided to enlist in the Navy for the Second World War?
Well, I'm sure that both my mother and my grandmother disapproved, but they never told me that. That wouldn't be the Quaker way. While they believed deeply in pure pacifism, they understood that others might not believe that way, and they accepted and respected that kind of belief.
We have a photograph here of the young lieutenant. You did your training at
Quonset Point, Rhode Island, and learned to stand straight and to keep my shoes clean. And I was pretty good in all the courses, actually. In fact, I did well enough that I was asked if I wanted to stay for air combat intelligence, which I didn't want to do, so I asked for ships and stations and was assigned to Ottumwa, Iowa, in the middle of Iowa, where there was no ship and no station yet, right in the middle of a cornfield. In fact, the only time I've ever had a gun in my hand, when I was growing up, I never went fishing except once and then quit. And we didn't hunt. And the only time I ever had a gun in my hand was at Quonset. And I remember as officers, we were all given .45s. That was part of our equipment. But we had to go out in the range and learn how to shoot them. And I took 10 shots at the target. I didn't hit it once. And so I carried the .45 with me. I didn't ever use it abroad. I had it with me if necessary. And I don't have a gun in the house up to this point. I wouldn't know how to use it.
It's a good thing you weren't called on to.
That's right.
And then you did, from Ottumwa, you did get overseas
Well, from
assignment.
Ottumwa, a notice again came on the board there indicating that officers who were 29 years of age or younger, and I had just turned 29, could apply for sea duty. So I applied for sea duty. I'll never forget it. I felt very badly about the way this was handled. 2 or 3 of us did that because we were anxious to get to sea, to do something that was more close to the war effort. And Doris Gurley, that name shouldn't fool you. It's D-O-R-R-I-S. It wasn't a wave. A very vigorous man was my commanding officer. And I remember he was very hurt when my application came across his desk. He said, why didn't you tell me about this? And I says, well, Commander, should have, but you know, I didn't want you to feel that you were being put upon or anything like that. I didn't want to ask for you for a favor. So he went out of the room, and he came back with a Coca-Cola, and he had one in his hand. Here, he said, drink this. You're not going to get those out there in the Pacific.
How did you say goodbye to your family?
Well, it was a rather painful occasion. I recall that we were all at the Union Station in Los Angeles, and my grandmother was there, and my mother, and my father, and the brothers. It was not tearful. It was just sort of sad, because, you know, in that war, you never knew what was going to happen. I guess they all felt, well, this may be the last time you see somebody.
Did you think you'd come back?
Oh, yes, yes. I had never had any fear of that. Let me say one thing, too. I don't want to give the impression that as far as I was concerned, that when I applied for officers training when I was an OPA, or when I applied for sea duty when I was in Ottumwa, or when I applied for going up the line when they put me in Noumea, New Caledonia, that I was a real brave fellow and wanted to get up there where the action was. It was just simply an innate feeling, inner feeling, that it was vitally important to be where the action was. Not to show your courage, but that was your responsibility. You had to be there. I felt that if I didn't get where the action was, I would not have done my duty. Now let me say, there are thousands, yes, millions, who never got up the line, and they certainly did their duty. But I felt I at least had to try, or otherwise I would have regretted it.
Let me interrupt 1 second. Keep rolling.
Get back to the other picture.
Yes, we want to. These pictures shouldn't be rolling.
Yeah, I want to see that other picture.
These pictures
Who was that?
shouldn't be
Was
rolling.
that picture with the nurse?
I think so.
I can't believe it. I think I recognize that one.
We should go to the top with just the president and next to the palm tree.
Now this one here, isn't that a nurse? Wait a minute, no.
We're going to bring them. We'll bring them. We'll start with this one and then bring them back up.
God, where'd you get these pictures? Where the hell did they get these pictures?
From your.
No, did I bring them home? See, who would have had them? Did I have them?
Some of them were. I don't know.
Yeah, but
Some of them were snapshots.
Yeah, but I mean,
who would have brought them?
who would have brought them? It had to be me, and I don't even remember them. Somebody else must have. I remember her. I got something with her and Lindbergh. See if Lindbergh isn't in that next picture. That's what I was going to say.
Oh, okay. You shipped out on the SS Monroe to.
Yes.
Where did it
Well,
go to?
It was one of the President liners. It was a luxury liner fitted out for 250 luxury passengers, and we had 3,000 on it. We lived, the officers were in bunks 3 high on the walls and so forth and so on. It took 17 days to get to Noumea, New Caledonia. And I remember the most unpleasant experience on that was not the fact that we had to wear life belts at times and so forth and so on, but was the fact that that I was, of course, allergic to seasickness. And they used to bet. We only had 2 meals a day. And my friends who were sitting at our table used to take bets among each other as to how long I'd stay at the table. I seldom got through a full meal, but I didn't lose much weight on the way.
We have some pictures here from. I guess they're from different points of your time in the Pacific. Do you recollect any of the places or people?
That could be Guadalcanal, I think. I think I'm standing alone there, and that's the way we did. Of course, it was in the tropics, and you didn't wear a coat. I remember that, I think.
The next picture, I think, is Green Island.
Now, where am I? The second man?
Third, we're going to zero in on you in the
That's right.
wearing the solar tope.
Yeah. I remember that one very well. Yes, and that's Augie Kuntz, the commanding officer is next to me, and Harry Van Loo, who was a great United Airlines pilot who's further over, if you can move it back again. It looks to me in that picture that I had that 5 o'clock shadow problem then, as well as later. And that, incidentally, is a nurse there. Let me tell you an interesting thing in that respect. I recall, and what in the world is this?
This looks like, this is SCAT headquarters.
Yes.
Let's hold that and...
But where? But I recall, for example, when I see that nurse, I was reading Lindbergh's diaries, wartime diaries, which are fascinating, and he kept a marvelous diary. And he recounts in there his going to Green Island. And he recounts there the great excitement when a nurse came in on one of the SCAT planes, and that all of the men, thousands, New Zealanders were. It was the third New Zealand division was there. And I remember it well. In fact, Lindbergh came in on the same plane with the nurse. And nobody was paying any attention to him. I did. But everybody was hooting and hollering and catcalling and so forth, because my goodness, whistling, here was this nurse. I'm telling you, she could have been a chimpanzee, as I remember. She wasn't that pretty anyway, but she was a female, and they hadn't seen one for a long time. That night, incidentally, the commanding officer invited me to have dinner with him and half a dozen others with Lindbergh. And believe it or not, I turned it down because I was the host for the poker game that night. And I think back to turning down a chance to sit down with Lindbergh to have a poker game. I just cannot imagine it happened. And years later, I was glad that he could be a guest at the White House while I was president. He was a fine man.
How did a Quaker boy from Whittier become a poker shark?
I learned it on-the-job training, so to speak. And that's usually very expensive. But I seem to have a pretty good sense for poker, and I had pretty good instruction from my roommate, Jimmy Stewart, who was from New York and very suave and sophisticated, knew Sherman Billingsley and all of the beautiful people and all that sort of thing. And so I learned pretty well.
What was your technique?
Well, the technique was, in my case, was to play it very close to the vest. I knew when to get out of a pot. I didn't stick around when I didn't have the cards. I didn't bluff very often. I just bluffed enough so that when I really had the cards, people stayed in. Whenever I bluffed, in other words, I let it be known that I'd bluffed and lost so that I could stay in. And of course, my most vivid experience, and this is something that I imagine very few people, certainly any of our listeners, have probably never had this experience. I never forget in a stud poker game one night, I drew a hand. I understand would be at the odds of 650,000 to 1 that this could happen. I drew the ace of diamonds down, and then in order, exact order, came the king of diamonds, the queen of diamonds, the jack of diamonds, the 10 of diamonds, a royal flush, 4 of them showing. Well, I played it pretty well. There were pairs, a couple of the other fellows had pairs, and instead of raising, I just sort of checked, or stayed in or called and so forth and so on, till finally there was a pretty fair pot. But at the end, this is one of those times, when at the end I, of course, placed a big bet, and most everybody checked out. They thought maybe I had it. But this is one of the times you don't have to show it when you're not called. But I had to assert it. I turned over the ace, and everybody nobody had ever seen it before, and they'll never see it again.
In your memoirs, you wrote, you quoted Gladstone, I think, saying that a great prime minister must be a great butcher. Do you subscribe to the theory that a great president must be a great poker player?
It helps. The Russians, of course, are chess players. I never understood chess. It's much more complicated, much more complex. But many of the things you do in poker are very useful in politics and very useful in foreign affairs. One of the problems you see in foreign affairs, particularly in dealing with great leaders abroad, particularly those that are adversaries, is the almost insatiable tendency of American politicians to want to put everything out on the table. Their inability to know when to bluff, when to call, and above everything else, how to be unpredictable. Unpredictability is the greatest asset or weapon that a leader can have of a major country. And unless he is unpredictable, he's going to find that he loses a great deal of his power.
Do you recognize this young man?
I don't remember that picture, but I'm going to see these later.
You're going to get another look at him.
I know who it is. Yeah. I can't remember where that was. I don't know who would have taken the pictures.
What was, there's another.
Oh, there's our group. That's the Green Island group. Oh, I see on the left there, Hollis Dole. You see on my right, Hollis Dole.
Mm-hmm.
Hollis Dole was an officer. I was the commanding officer of I would say, the officer in charge of that detachment. And it was a wonderful group, let me say. Here's Red Hussey down there, and Massingale, who was a bartender from Texas, etc. And there's the doc back there. The doctor was with us. He was always used to say at the end of a day, well, another day and another $14. That's what doctors with flight pay got in those days. But let's come back here to this situation with regard to Hollis Dole. Hollis Dole was my roommate at Bella La Bella. And Bella La Bella, incidentally, was a PT boat harbor as well as being a scat base.
Did you ever meet John
And
Kennedy?
in that place, in Bella La Bella, years later, when I met when John Kennedy and I had debated for the first time at McKeesport, Pennsylvania, about the Taft-Hartley bill, we rode back on the train together and talked all night. And we talked about what we had done in the Pacific or where we had been. I asked him if he'd ever been in Bella La Bella. He said absolutely he'd been in there many times. And I said, it's very possible we met there because I went aboard a PT boat and met all the officers, but they were just lieutenants and I was just a lieutenant. They didn't remember me and I didn't remember them, but we laughed about the fact that we might have met. But in any event, at Bella La Bella, we had some problems, particularly insofar as some insects, I guess you wouldn't call them that. Centipedes are concerned. There were centipedes there. They were also all over the islands, but particularly in Bella La Bella, I remember this particular thing. Hollis Dole was my roommate. One night, some way, a centipede had gotten underneath the mosquito netting, and I felt something on my hand. It woke me up, and I flipped my hand like that, and the centipede dropped on Hollis Dole and bit him right here and here, and he was bleeding. The blood was coming down, just streaming down. These centipedes, this was this long. They're huge out there. And Dole said, oh my God, Dole knew something about centipedes. He says, I'm going to be out for at least 3 days because those centipede bites can sometimes even be fatal. They are always very painful. And so Dole went into the hospital for 3 days and then came out. And years later, he came into the government. And I saw him in the Oval Office at the White House. He was in the Department of the Interior. So we met again. Then Massingale is sitting down there in the middle of Tex Massendale, probably the second man over on the left in the first line. And I remember Massingale was our crew chief for loading and unloading planes. And one day we had a huge number of planes in. We brought in supplies, we took out litters and sitters, wounded and so forth and so on. And this crew was very overburdened. And the night before, Massingale had been bit by a centipede, and he came in huge swelling here. And I said, but Tex, I said, you can't possibly work today, can you? You got bit by a centipede? He said, yeah. He said, don't worry about it, Lieutenant. They grow twice that big down in Texas, and went through the rest of the day. Well, we had some good times there. Let me say, none of those in that first 2 rows, the officers are standing in back, graduated from college. They were high school graduates. Because I had to censor their mail, I knew about that they all had girlfriends or mothers or something like that, although I was very careful not to try to censor it too carefully. But they were the most ordinary men I've ever known. devoted, dedicated, and all wanted to go home, but only after they'd done their job.
It sounds like the platoons that you see in the movies, in the war movies.
Well, it was a war movie.
What was Nixon's hamburger stand?
Well, I think that's been exaggerated a bit. And what happened was that I found that you could get some hamburger meat on occasion for flight crews. And also I found that you could liberate some from time to time. The Seabees sometimes did that, and I ate in their mess. And so I knew how to make hamburger from my old days, and the flight crews would come in. And I set it up so that, and I fried the hamburgers there and gave them hamburgers when they came in. And on occasion, we'd give them a bottle of Australian beer. Now understand, this is at the end of the flight, not before. And that was excellent beer. That wasn't very often, however. So consequently, I was about the most popular officer in the South Pacific because of that hamburger stand. They were pretty good.
How are things liberated?
Well, the Seabees, people wonder why I was so much for the hard hats. I talk about remarkable men, and they were remarkable. I remember one time on Green Island, they were making an airstrip there, and there was an air raid signals, but some of them were false. And these big CB guys, they'd be in those big bulldozers, they'd ignore the signals, and they'd keep working there, even in the middle of the night with their lights on, in order to get the airstrip finished. Boy, they were something else. Most of them were from the East. This was the 22nd CB Battalion, and I got to know them very well, and I ate with them because I was the head of a small detachment. Army, Navy, Air Force were all members of it. I, being a naval officer, was the officer in charge, being a lieutenant and the ranking officer. And so I was able to select which mess we would use. Well, I turned on the Marine mess because the Marines could fight, but they couldn't cook. They were terrible cooks. I turned on the Army mess because they were almost as bad cooks as the Marines. The only other mess there was a CB mess, and it was the best. It wasn't because their cook was so good, but the CBs, you know, they had access to a lot of things. They could put in some flooring in your tent. They could make various utensils and so forth. And so they would trade for meat and other victuals for their mess. And what they didn't trade, they stole. And they were very good.
Did you,
They liberated, I mean.
Right. You did finally get up the line and see some action.
Well, these were really what you call action areas. But let's be quite candid about it. I think the most lively place I was in was Bougainville. There were about 13 or 14 days when we had air raids every night. One night it was pretty close. The Japanese plane used to come over. The way you could tell it was a Japanese plane is that the motors were not synchronized. And they go dee, 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 dee. Even without the air raid, you knew it was a Japanese plane coming over. And they were really harassing us because our Air Force had knocked out most of their power. One night, there was no air raid, and we heard this plane. It had come in very low, and we heard the bombs dropping as they came down the runway. They were dropping. And we dived out of our cabin into the foxhole. As soon as we got out, we saw that our whole tent had been sprayed with bullets. It was a close one.
Why was SCAT called Murder Incorporated?
Because we lost a lot of planes. Wasn't our fault, though. You see, we didn't have the navigation devices and all that sort of thing. These were DC-3s operating over enemy waters and enemy territories, but also operating against very, very tough weather conditions on occasion. And it wasn't that bad. I was never afraid to ride it.
What did you do?
I was what we call an operations officer. I determined how big the load should be, how many passengers we could take, made up the manifest, the flight times, checked the planes in and out, and that sort of thing. It's sort of routine.
How did you keep in touch with home? Did you get letters or write letters back?
Oh, yes, every day. I wrote letters every day of the 14 months I was there, numbered them all, and Pat wrote to me every day, numbered them all. I must say the most important thing of all was getting the mail. I remember, incidentally, that reminds me of the other person I saw two celebrities in the South Pacific. One day in Noumea, I was riding on a road from in Noumea up to a base further north, and sirens were heard, and we pulled off to the side. I was in a Jeep, and riding in a weapons carrier, sitting very straight, was Eleanor Roosevelt. And I thought that was really great. Here she was out here where the action was. And then up on Bougainville one day, Harold Stassen came through. And of course I was interested in him because although I was not in politics yet, I had interest in it. I knew that he'd been the youngest governor, the boy wonder in Minnesota. He was attached to Halsey's staff, and I remember meeting him. I shook his hand, and he said, "I'm just up here checking to see how the mail is. Is the mail coming in all right?" And I said, "Yes, sir, Governor, the mail's coming in fine." That was the first time I met him, and from that time on, I was a Stassen man until after 1948 when he didn't make the nomination for president.
Didn't take much to convince you.
Very little. Oh, contacts are very simple. As a matter of fact, you talk about Jerry Voorhees, as we will a little later. The first time I met Jerry Voorhees, he wouldn't remember, I'm sure, but I remembered it very well, was in 1935. Between my first and second years at Duke, I went home, and Jack Petit, who had won the Constitutional Oratorical Championship at Whittier High School 2 years before I had gone on to Pomona College, where he became national champion of the Constitutional Oratorical group. And Jack Petit invited me and about 12 or 15 other young people, voting age, to his barn. Now really it was a barn converted into sort of a playroom. And sitting there in the middle was a young person who was running for Congress. He was smoking a pipe. He was a professor or a lecturer at Pomona College. It was Jerry Voorhees. I remember how impressed I was. He was highly idealistic. I don't remember what he talked about, but I can say this, he impressed me, he impressed everybody else there, and if I had voted in 1936, which I did not, I would have voted for him.
Gentlemen, just continue to look at each other and talk. I'm going to make a light change and pull out here.
Well, we covered a fair amount of
Still got some more.
territory today. I think we're getting more into the, we're out of or getting out of the flow of anecdotes and getting much more into specific
From now?
chunks. Yes.
Oh, yes.
Getting much more into specific
Yeah.
chunks of
Which will go faster.
history, yes.
The anecdotes may prove to be the most interesting thing you got, though.
Yeah.
What do you
We've
think?
had, I think so, and we've got them. So that however it's edited, they're there.
Now let's see, now we've got to get home.